Welcome, everyone, to our last and final guest speaker series for the class. And I am thrilled to welcome for the first time my colleague and friend, Dr. Lawrence Markowitz, who is a professor of political science at Rowan University, specializing in the study of state building, authoritarianism, and political violence with a focus on Central Asia. Dr. Markowitz has published two books on the region, the first in 2013 titled State Erosion: Unlootable Resources and Unruly Elites in Central Asia, and the more recent one in 2019, Webs of Corruption, Trafficking and Terrorism in Central Asia. He is also the author of more than a dozen articles and as nearly as many policy briefs on the region, and I am thrilled to have him here for the first time in our class. Dr. Markowitz, good to see you once again. Welcome to the insanity that is the Central Asian component of post-communist transition.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Well, we have a lot to talk about. So it's a very rich region with a lot of great, interesting topics and themes. Where do we begin?
Well, there's the wonderful thing I love about the Central Asian section is that we seem to have the most open-ended areas of discussion. Just in past classes, students know little to nothing about Central Asia beyond the fact that most of the countries end in stan. But at the end, there seems to be this big fascination. Students really like this section, I think just because it's new, and they find the material so interesting. So I guess what I should ask you is, since you specialize in the region, what got you interested in Central Asia?
I've been asked that before because usually, a family get-togethers or something, people wonder why Uzbekistan or Tajikistan, to the extent that they can actually say those things. And there's plenty of funny stories that I can bring to bear about, my early years and trying to talk to people about what I was interested in. It was a gradual process. I got a grant to do some research for a master's thesis to go to Uzbekistan. And I had already been looking a little bit more into Central Asia in the course of doing a master's degree at American University in international affairs. It was a very theoretically oriented program, but there was an area studies component. So I got a grant, started studying Uzbek. I had been to Russia a couple of times, worked on my Russian, and that was in 1997. There apparently are not a lot of career paths once you start to learn Uzbek for going in and doing something with Uzbek. So I began to be more and more focused towards academics. I did work briefly at the World Bank after my master's degree, quickly applied for a PhD and began to focus. I had done the master's thesis, like a 100-page thesis on Uzbekistan, on identity, and I really was much more towards the road towards academics in that path. But I had already been to Russia a couple of times, had been doing some study abroad, and had gradually moved in that direction. And by the time I started my PhD, I was pretty firmly focused on the region. So I've been going to the region, doing field research in the region for, whatever that is, the last 25 years. And I've done field research as well, a little bit in Russia, Georgia, and Armenia. But by and large, it's been mostly in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. Although I have published some things that are touching on the other stands. But those are the main countries that I know the most, is Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. I speak Uzbek fairly well, or I used to. I've lost a lot. And, of course, I know some Russian. I think for me, I think the important thing to start off with is, in thinking about Central Asia, is that it's a rich area that has a lot of interesting intersecting themes. It's pretty much a small region of something like 60 to 80 million people. The birth rate is high, so it grows, but it's not a large number of people across 5 different countries, and yet you can pretty much look at any kind of comparative theme that you are interested in, and they pretty much have it. Whether you're talking about oil and politics, ethnic conflict, Islam and Islamic activism, geopolitical arrangements, anything for that a political scientist or someone who's interested in international affairs, you can pretty much see an important theme, or a way in which it resonates in Central Asia. To understand Central Asia, though, I'd say an easy starting point is to think about three things. Number one is that there is a pre-Soviet history, and there's sort of a political ecology to the region that is important to keep in mind. That it is a region that is very rural. It is, it is very much centrally located in Central Asia. And so that lack of access to ports is an important thing to keep in mind. It historically was part of the Silk Road. So while it was a frontier, it was situated prior to the Soviet period, prior to the Tsarist period, it was situated very much in the center of many large imperial economies. And there was emerging over many years kind of like a nomadic sedentary continuum or interaction that doesn't continue today, but it's shaped in sort of subtle ways the nature of the region. So that's important to keep in mind, that this is a region that is largely agricultural. 60 to 65% of every country's population is pretty much in the rural area. That somewhat has diminished over time recently. Number two is Central Asia, compared to other parts of the former Soviet space, has been most significantly influenced by the Soviet period than the other areas. Many of the Soviet legacies you have read about in Central Europe, or in Ukraine, or Belarus, or Moldova, they seem to have carried more weight, and especially within the political institutions, they remain more sticky, and they kind of linger longer. And that is partly because there had not been, there's a work by Keith Darden and Anna Grishmalabus, an article about identity and pre-Soviet identity and how that's shaped and sort of pre-Soviet politics. Central Asia did not have a strong set of national identities before the Soviet period. It was largely made up. The political entities were three main entities: the two khanates and one emirate, the Emirate of Bukhara, the Khanate of Kokand, and the Khanate, or it was the Emirate of Bukhara. Anyway, Bukhara, Kokand. There's one more that I can't think of. Khiva. Okay, there we go. I knew it. And so Central Asia didn't have this pre-existing concentration of national identities. It didn't have the same kind of, it was also largely rural and didn't have a large urban area. And also the leaders of post-Soviet Central Asia initially, with the exception of Kyrgyzstan, well, even Kyrgyzstan to some extent, these were leaders. These were Soviet era leaders. In other words, you didn't have a turnover of new leadership initially with the post-Soviet states. So there are many other reasons as well, but the Soviet legacies have remained in place. And then, so that's an important second thing. So number one is this political ecology, the pre-Soviet period, thinking about its legacies in very subtle ways. Number two is the very proximate and very significant history and legacy of the Soviet Union and its institutions and its practices. And then thirdly, just a lot of dynamics of the post-Soviet period that kind of have increasingly complicated our understanding of the region. When I was starting to study the region in the 1990s, part of the frustration was there wasn't clear political outcomes or political or interesting dynamics occurring. But now, well, you have like three revolutions in Kyrgyzstan. You've had three presidents leave office, one, horizontally, Niyazov. One gave up power, and then, two horizontally, Karimov and Niyazov in Turkmenistan and Karimov in Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan's former president, Nazarbayev, has stepped aside, but there's sort of like a dual legitimacy question about who really kind of has political influence in that country. You have enormously changing economies and the role of China, the diminishing role of the US and Russia. So there's so many complicating factors now I took a class in the 1990s on Central Asia. I want to take a class on Central Asia as a master's student. And so I was able to take a class at Georgetown and count it towards my master's degree. And the course title was Central Asia End to Isolation, ? And the question, it was like in 1996. And the instructor was like, it's pretty much still isolated. Well, that is not the case today. Central Asia is anything but isolated. It's actually very much a set of countries that are very complicated, very interesting, and are very much interwoven with the international community, just in ways that we don't typically see. So I'll stop there, but I mean, it's a very easy framework, the pre-Soviet, Soviet, and post-Soviet, but as a starting point, it's important to just sort of.
So just a few follow-up questions from your observations here. So, the Soviet period, as you mentioned, heavily influenced, I guess, the current political, social, economic landscape. Is Russian still widely spoken throughout Central Asia? Is it still considered to be, the language of diplomacy, business, and the language of, let's say, the upper classes of society, or have the local languages like Uzbek and Kazakh and Kyrgyz and others started to replace that?
It varies based on the country. Generally speaking, in Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and I'm not as confident about Turkmenistan, but I believe in Turkmenistan as well. So Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, all the and what am I missing? Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan. Anyway, all of them except Kazakhstan have generally had Russian continue to exist and sometimes be used in the workplace, especially in the capital cities where you have more of a diversity. If you have sort of like a non-Kazakh or non-Kyrgyz speaker at a workplace, at a bank or something, they're going to be speaking Russian. Also, anyone in that kind of service capacity has to know Russian in order to interface with the diversity of customers. But in terms of the government operations, it's generally those national languages that have displaced Russian. The difference being in Kazakhstan is that Kazakhstan is distinct as the only country in Central Asia where there remains a significant Russian minority. And that is a fundamental key point in understanding how Kazakhstan policies are, a lot of its domestic and some of its international policies operate. So I don't remember exactly the status, but both Russian and Kazakh are equally spoken there.
And so, as far as these other cultures are concerned, I remember there's an article that's now about 30 years old, written by Ronald Grigorsuni, who talked about the need for creating political cultures of countries in Central Asia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, whereas beforehand, one could just be part of a larger Soviet collective identity, even though regional, identities, ethnicities, and cultures existed. But now they have to be elevated to the state level. It would raise questions like, well, what does it mean to be a Kazakh? What does it mean to be an Uzbek? What does it mean to be a Tajik or a Kyrgyz? And I remember one part of that article, very small, but it was very, very memorable, where some elements of the emerging Kazakh cultural intelligentsia were trying to create links between Kazakhstan and the Mongolian Empire, and somehow making links between Kazakhstan and Genghis Khan. And the only time that Mongolia ever really gets out into the world media today is when someone tries to appropriate Genghis Khan, and they're like, nope, Genghis Khan is ours, find someone else. And then they just go back to just kind of doing their own thing in the Eastern Asian steppe here. What is the difference? This might sound like a naive question, but most of the audience here are neophytes when it comes to Central Asia. Like, what is the difference between a Kazakh and an Uzbek, or a Turkmen, or a Kyrgyz? Are they all part of a larger collective of Turkic-speaking peoples, with the exception of the Tajiks, which speak a Persian dialect? Has there been efforts within the last 30 years within these countries to if not, appropriate existing cultural narratives and symbols, but to sort of create them in a way? right? I mean, we're talking about countries that kind of woke up one morning and realized, oh, the Soviet Union collapsed. I guess we're on our own. It's very different from that of the Baltic states or the Caucasus, where it is easy for Armenians to default back to Armenians or Georgians to Georgians. But Central Asia is a different story, correct?
That's correct. Ethnic or national identities are not nearly as strongly felt or as deeply embedded as they are in Eastern Europe, say, because they did not necessarily precede the Soviet period. There were ethno-linguistic communities that were loosely defined, and there was a lot of intermarriage and intersection and interaction between these groups, but they became kind of like the ethnicities that were kind of crafted and formalized under European colonialism in Africa, very in sort of a parallel way. These ethnic identities were kind of formally constructed and reinforced through Soviet policy. And that's right. The way in which the Soviet Union broke down under the pressure of nationalist mobilization, as Mark Beisinger's book shows, the Baltic states mobilized first, then came, a bunch of other intermediate countries or republics like Georgia and Armenia, and Central Asia was the laggard. They were the last ones. In fact, Turkmenistan never even had a protest that actually, it didn't really have a significant amount of nationalist mobilization that actually called for secession. They may have had some mobilization, but nobody in Turkmenistan formed a protest that actually called for self-determination. Is the only Union republic that didn't have that. The other republics, as I mentioned before, none of those nationalist mobilizations displaced the sitting leaders. So there was a certain amount of nationalist mobilization within Central Asia, but it was not nearly as strong as in other areas. And Central Asia, as the Soviet Union over the 7 decades that it was in place, as it introduced and promoted ethnic identities and national identities, and also it was a dual policy of promoting them, and like Ron Sunni's book, Revenge of the Past suggests. But then if you look at work from before, it talks about the nation breaking efforts of collectivization and other kinds of Stalinist repression and control over language, literature, the arts, culture. So there was sort of a nation making and a nation breaking kind of Janus-faced policy there. That very much existed in Central Asia, and in that sense, it's very similar and kind of uniform across the Soviet space. But today, national identities in Central Asia, I mean, they are strongly felt. It is not just because they were basically constructed by during the Soviet period. Doesn't mean you should go to Central Asia and tell anyone that. Don't walk around Central Asia being like, you're not really a Kyrgyz. It's an invented identity. People will take offense to that. There has been in the last few months in April, the last few days of April this year, there was a series of conflicts between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, some border disputes. And that generated a significant upswell of nationalist Kyrgyz sentiment. And so nationalism in Kyrgyzstan actually is on the rise. There has been periods of ethnic violence in Kyrgyzstan, as in a couple of other areas, especially in Kazakhstan over the last few years. And in 2010, there was a significant outbreak of ethnic violence targeting minority Uzbeks, where like 400 people were killed and 2,000 people were displaced. And since that time, nationalism, pro-Kyrgyz, exclusionary forms of nationalism has been on the rise in Kyrgyzstan. So people very much consider themselves Kyrgyz or Uzbek. That is the primary identity. There are, however, other competing identities, which are oftentimes more focused around locality or village or region. The pan-Islamic, pan-Turkic identities don't really resonate. That was sort of like there was a flash in the pan of that being an issue, or kind of like a potential resonating identity in the early 1900s, but it has not continued.
Because that seems to be something, again, I just want to just very briefly just focus on this pan-Turkic thing. This seems to be something that Erdogan in Turkey itself seems to be pushing or promoting. Is there really this sense of receptivity in Central Asia for, Turkey trying to promote this idea that we're all just, one big family? I know that Azerbaijan likes to, hang out with Erdogan, but does the five stands really care, or are they really more interested in maintaining better relations with Russia and now increasingly China?
I think both at the elite and the mass levels, they're pretty agnostic towards Turkey. They would be like, well, what do you bring to the table? China brings a lot of money. Russia brings security. What do you bring? I don't think that the cultural affiliation or the cultural similarities are enough. It should be said that Azeri, of all the Turkic languages, Azeri is closest to Turkish. Turkish and Uzbek, Turkish and Kyrgyz and Kazakh, all of these are not mutually intelligible. So just because I know Uzbek, I actually can't understand Azeri, let alone Turkish, which is even further afar. I can understand a few things, and sometimes I can understand some words in Kyrgyz and Kazakh, but it's pretty hard. But they're really not mutually intelligible languages. So I don't think that that's an influence that is very significant. I think, as you noted, China and Russia are really the ones that, quite much more the case, they're the ones that matter. And someone who's like, whether they're a government official or an everyday person, just to kind of make this a little bit more concrete, they'd be like, yeah, well, like in Samarkand, there may be investment from South Korea and a Chinese investment in a major factory or a mine in Kyrgyzstan. I mean, they by virtue of their geographical location, they have had a number of connections around all sorts of areas, all sorts of countries, including Iran and India. So, yeah.
So what makes Central Asia then so enticing is that, it's this area that people know almost nothing about. It seems to be an area that almost had to develop statehood and identity along with independence that was just kind of given to them. I know that this might be, too, quick of a statement to make here, but it seems like the region is enjoying this renaissance of external investment. You mentioned the Chinese and the Russians. There's also the Indians. There's the Iranians. It's an area that might be overwhelmingly rural, but it produces some of the largest amounts of natural resource exports. We're talking natural gas, oil. This obviously was part of the old, Soviet pipeline here. But I show my students pictures of the capital cities of countries in Central Asia, or with Kazakhstan, they think they change the capital every decade or something like that, right? I mean, it looks like this. It looks like Las Vegas. It's just like you can see. I mean, I kind of.
The capital of Kazakhstan does look like Las Vegas.
Right. I mean, I kind of lovingly refer to the region, especially when you look at, let's say, Tashkent in Turkmenistan, right? It kind of looks like some despotic Disneyland, right? Lots of fountains and statues and animatronic monuments that are, rotating around and stuff. I mean, it looks like, just money is being pumped into these cities that look like, from maybe the 70s or the 80s, some peripheral Soviet town, now into these like sprawling, business parks and metropolises. So obviously there's money, and obviously the people that are running these countries, they might be leftovers from the Soviet Union, but they're savvy, one can imagine, economic power brokers too, right?
They're more savvy than you'd imagine because, yes, there's a good amount of international investment. And of course, they are the producer of a number of commodities, all the ones you mentioned, along with cotton, oil, cotton, natural gas, oil, and uranium and gold and other minerals. But the key to understanding the political economy of these countries is to understand that they are largely autocratic regimes, with the exception of Kyrgyzstan. And there is an enormous concentration of wealth and power at the top. And like I mentioned, 60 to 65% of the population is still rural. Those people in rural areas have limited access, especially in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, but also even in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. they have limited access to good medical care, limited access to economic opportunities. They just don't have access to cash and capital. In many ways, those Soviet systems of state salaries are still kind of in place. There isn't really a private sector in the rural areas. In the urban areas, there are emerging economies, and there is a good amount of capital and some private entrepreneurship. But depending on the country, it is often the case that there's the state apparatus, the security apparatus, or power brokers that are either centered in the prosecutor's office or in the district governor's office that will carry out, let's say, surprise inspections, find flaws, or fire code violations or tax code violations that require fines and bribes. And so these are countries that are routinely seen as highly corrupt, difficult to do business in. To give you an analogy, many of those pretty buildings I noticed are really fancy, but actually what they are old Soviet structures that have had the outsides covered in these fancy things. Not all of them, and the ones in Astana or Nur-Sultan, as it's called now, that's a new city, but many of the buildings in Tashkent and even some in Almaty and Bishkek, they're not really new buildings. They're just like covered. And then you walk inside and they're like breaking down, and there's, the cement is peeling off the walls, but you look outside and it's a brand new sparkling window siding, looks, brand new. So I don't know, there's an analogy there somewhere.
Well, the analogy, I mean, it's not the most academic, it's not the most scientific, but I always noted that Bishkek looks more like a university campus than a sprawling business park. The center of Bishkek kind of looks like, the buildings look like they could house the social science departments for universities, right? But there is something to be said about that, and Kyrgyzstan having, again, this, you can draw your own conclusions here, but the most democratic potential. Because the way that you're describing these countries, which is very reminiscent to leftover institutional legacies from the Soviet period, but also very much indicative of outside the capital, areas, careers that bring in money or a guaranteed income are usually within the security sector or some state apparatus, which makes these positions incredibly lucrative and heavily guarded. They don't really seem like they're fertile grounds for democratic development. They don't really seem like the area seems ready to accommodate, let alone tolerate, nascent public civil society. We look at Kyrgyzstan, which is the exception to these 5 countries. Kyrgyzstan has a tulip revolution every decade. And just within the last year or so, there have been maybe 2 or 3 presidents that came into power, were overthrown, caretaker government. I mean, ever since I guess Soronbay Jeenbekov's presidency was ousted, the country seems to be in a sense of political turmoil, which, yes, could give it, I guess, some indication that authoritarian state capture is not as strong as it is in Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan or clearly Turkmenistan. But it also shows that the wealth and the power and the oligarchism is directly related to the amount of authoritarian state control. And those that, the very small groups of people at the top that run the country are those that control the fate of the other 85 to 90%, correct?
I think that's correct. That's right. And I think that with the exception of Kyrgyzstan, civil society is very much attenuated, marginalized. They're not significant. Also, political parties are not significant players in any of the politics, with the exception of maybe Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. So if you think about Lukin Way and Steve Levitsky's competitive authoritarianism, there is truly some degree of competitive politics in Kyrgyzstan, not really so in Kazakhstan, although it kind of looks like it might be closer there and elsewhere. And then Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan are clearly not competitive at all. And in all countries, though, there is a concentration of power within the executive branch under the district and provincial governors, leading straight up to the ministries, to the president's office.
And we
In
should point out that
addition, the
these are
security.
these are presidential systems, not parliamentary systems.
Well, Kyrgyzstan
The
is
one exception.
the exception a little bit. It had shifted to a parliamentary system after 2010,
Yep.
and now it's back more towards a mix of a presidential parliamentary, but it's still pretty much now a presidential system. And so there's a lot of the wealth and power is concentrated under the president and under the different ministries underneath him. And truly, in a truly autocratic way, while there might be some competition in the elections and there might be some civil society in Kyrgyzstan, the other countries really don't have much of that, those indicators of pluralism at all. Now, there have been signs of some reform occurring in Uzbekistan. The longstanding ruler, longstanding president, Islam Karimov, died in 2016 and was replaced by a power broker named Shavkat Mirziyoyev. In doing my dissertation research, I spent 2 months in Samarkand region doing research in the region, and he was governor at the time. And he became like my case of a highly oppressive, autocratic ruler on the ground. There are stories about him. He's not anyone to be trifled with. But when he became president, he implemented this plan of kind of presenting the country more towards a path of technocratic reform and moving away from distinguishing his leadership from the Karimov regime, reducing the power of the coercive apparatus, completely turning around the nature of foreign relations between the stands. So Uzbekistan, which is geographically located between all of them, was much more open to more positive foreign relations, which has been very beneficial to the region as a whole. But the truth is that in the last year or so, it's clear that there's a sort of a limit to the amount of political reform he's willing to introduce.
At least as far as Freedom House is concerned, and take the data as you will, when Karimov died, the country was at 7.7 political rights and civil liberties. Now they're at 6.5. So check out that, you know.
Right.
But I think isn't it also
there is some change, but it's clearly within the basic boundaries, and there has not been really any significant diffusion of power away from the executive to the judicial branch or to the parliament.
Is it because also is Uzbekistan opening more up to the international community? I mean, I understand that Uzbekistan, at least comparatively speaking, under Karimov, was more closed off. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, definitely more open internationally. But it was really Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan that seemed the most hermetically sealed.
That's right. And under, I forget the term of the kind of economy, the import substitution industrialization model, where you're not engaging in a lot of trade, and you're basically trying to keep all your productive power domestically, and maybe you'll export some goods, but you're really not becoming dependent on imported goods. The truth is that Uzbekistan was dependent on a lot of imported goods. It couldn't get away from that, but it really tried to become much more self-contained. I think there was an attempt by Karimov to exercise significant control over all sectors, politics, society, and the economy. Karimov came to power in 1989 during a series of ethnic riots and violence in the eastern part of the country, in the Fergana Valley, which is the most densely populated and most religiously conservative part of the country. And there was, I think, that experience and the nationalist mobilization kind of congealed within him this attempt to really exercise fairly strong control and so he saw open borders, emerging democratic change and political reforms and economic liberalization. All of these things will fuel the fires of instability and threaten the regime and threaten, regime security and his control. And those are things that were clearly sidelined.
So it seems then that, especially with a country like Central Asia, like at least nascent attempts at reform, some improvement, usually comes when the long-standing leader either dies or steps down. So Kadymov dies, and Uzbekistan makes these little baby steps towards engaging the outside, the outside world. In Kazakhstan, Nazarbayev still has this omnipresent authority within the country. Right? I think he's just almost like president emeritus at this point. Right? I mean, the old man is just looking.
I wish I had that authority as professor emeritus.
Yeah, well, I mean, when we think about this,
he's father of the nation.
Well, the funny thing, we think about this, and I should mention this for our viewers here, is that Nazarbayev has been in control of Kazakhstan longer than Putin. And in many respects, Putin draws from many of the leadership type that Nazarbayev had. I mean, he was effectively running the Kazakh SSR at the time of dissolution, and he just kind of gradually, just morphs into the president until he decides, hey, I'm good, my legacy is fine, the capital is moved, I'm looking to basically retire, but still be, dictator emeritus. But that also gives some attempt of the country to develop. If I'm not mistaken, the only remaining original leader of the country of the country within the region is the current president of Tajikistan, correct?
Well, technically, Rahman came to office in 1992, so wasn't a Soviet leader.
Right. Okay. Right. So, yes, that's right. I forgot.
But he's probably the longest, the person longest in power. I think the distinction of Kazakhstan for your students to keep in mind is that the leadership, Kazakhstan has embarked on a sophisticated mode of autocratic rule. It's been careful not to emphasize Kazakh identity over Russian identity, so it's balanced that. It's promoted it's been very open to international affairs and has been the most outwardly facing republic of the region, and one of the most outwardly facing republics of the former Soviet space. It immediately gave up nuclear weapons. It has tried to join any kind of international organization that it could. It has generally tried to actually take a leadership role in some of those organizations. That kind of international, that kind of modernized international focus is part of the Nazarbayev image. And that is partly why there's been a development in creating this new city, first Astana, now named after him, Nur-Sultan, that's his first name. And it's kind of like it's a very carefully crafted plan of political and economic development that hasn't embarked on democratization, but has developed many other areas. And lastly, I'll say, that kind of sophisticated, careful balancing act is evident also in how it's dealt with the Uyghur question. There's essentially a genocide or a cultural genocide occurring in Xinjiang, the region in Western China, which, the Uyghur language is mutually intelligible with Uzbek. Like you can parachute me into Urumqi, the capital, and I could just walk the street speaking comfortably with anyone there, even though I have, a terrible accent, but like it's a Central Asian region. And there are also people who are of Kazakh descent and are ethnically Kazakhs who are swept up in these in the violence in the essentially the camps that China has created there. And Kazakhstan has kind of balanced welcoming refugees with taking a very kind of non-confrontational stance against China, because it has a lot of dependence, economic relations with China, and there's a lot of investment coming to China. So it's done this for the last 30 years, where it's been very astute in managing the geopolitical international relationships with the domestic pressures. And I could give you other examples about how it's very cleverly cultivated foreign direct investment from oil companies, international oil companies, to develop its oil fields in its western regions. And then was very skillful in getting this private capital in, but kind of worked out a way to kind of trap it and remain in control of those oil fields. So it's not like Nigeria, for example, which is basically like half owned by private, like ExxonMobil and stuff like that. And there's very little state, there's less state control. Kazakhstan is being able to retain control. So they are certainly not democratic. And there's a lot of questions about who runs the country. And there's a lot of problems in Kazakhstan. Don't get me wrong. They have ethnic issues. They have a lot of criminal activity and criminal violence. And there's all kinds of economic inequality and other issues. But they have been pretty skillful in managing other very difficult challenges. Lastly, I'll say Kazakhstan is huge. I mean, it's almost as big as Russia, right? So it's very hard to govern a region that is so expansive. And then Kyrgyzstan is always the exception. So Kazakhstan has been fairly open to international affairs and international relationships, but so has Kyrgyzstan. The difference, though, is that, I mean, broadly speaking, Kyrgyzstan has democratized or tried to democratize early on under Askar Akayev, its first president. And for the first, Akayev was in power for 3 terms, 3 5-year terms, 90 to 95, 95 to 2000, 2000, 2005. And even though he attempted to democratize initially in his first term, over the course of his second and third term, he became increasingly autocratic and controlling, and there was a concentration of rents and profits. He began looking more and more like his neighbors, and was eventually overthrown in the Tulip Revolution in 2005. But one of the key distinguishing features of Kyrgyzstan, I would say, is this early democratization, coupled with the fact that its state capacity has been always somewhat weaker than its neighbors, except for Tajikistan during the Civil War. But basically, Kyrgyzstan, in any kind of question you're trying to deal with, it has a lot of bureaucratic inefficiencies. It just can't get its act together in implementing stuff. And that is a bad thing, of course, but maybe that helps support or provide space for a civil society and a certain amount of pluralism within the country. But Kyrgyzstan is a very complicated case. I mean, I think the other countries are complicated, but Kyrgyzstan, it just seems more complicated because we know a lot more about it, because it's much more accessible.
Yeah, and I think not only that, but it seems to be, at least in terms of the, not just the first, but the second Tulip Revolution, there is a mobilized civil society within the country that is ready to, challenge the incumbent leadership, put pressure on them to make reforms or changes. And I think what's also the case is that Kyrgyzstan is, even though it's relatively smaller, much smaller than Kazakhstan and others, it's heavily decentralized. I think there's always an issue of trying to govern from Bishkek without having to worry about problems or challenges from Osh or Jalalabad or any of the other places, right? So it's almost like power is much more diffused in the country than we find, centrally located in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan.
That's true. And there's also a north-south division. Southern Kyrgyzstan has typically been more agriculturally oriented, and has historically during the Soviet period was sort of like less invested in, and also is where the 14% of the population of ethnic Uzbeks lives. And the Uzbek minority are primarily in the urban areas in the south, but it is more decentralized, and there is a lot. I mean, it is true that under Akayev and then under Bakiyev, Kurmanbek Bakiyev became president after the Tulip Revolution. So Kurmanbek Bakiyev was president from 2005 to 2010. But I wouldn't say that civil society groups or urban-based mobilized opposition overthrew Akayev in 2005 and Bakiyev in 2010. There's an article by Scott Radnitz in Journal Democracy, which is actually quite readable and accessible. It says like what really happened in Kyrgyzstan, and it basically says it's part of your reading, right? So he pretty much says that Kyrgyzstan doesn't look like the other countries that had the color revolutions. That the way in which Michael McFaul wrote about there being like, civil society, quasi democratic, quasi autocratic regimes, urban-based mobilization and all this stuff. That didn't happen in Kyrgyzstan. It was more local, it was more decentralized, it was more rural-based, and it was basically led by local politicians who didn't get elected and were kind of, mobilizing to object to the parliamentary election in May 2005. The protests that occurred and the mobilization that overthrew Bakiyev in 2010 look even less like that kind of model from Ukraine and Serbia and Georgia, because the mobilization that overthrew Bakiyev occurred largely because Bakiyev basically increasingly criminalized the regime. He put his brother in charge of the security apparatus. There was a lot of criminal activity, drug trafficking, and other concentrations of the economic rents under his family's control. He came from the South, and he privileged leaders from the South over those in the North, exacerbating the North-South division. And there was a general weakening of state capacity. And people, I've done interviews in Kyrgyzstan about this, and people were basically like turning to criminal bosses to protect their interests. So it's very much like the rise of the mafia in Russia in the 1990s, where you saw the state role diminish. It's not quite a failed state in 2010, but certainly much weakened, and and certainly experienced a lot of presidential abuses under Bakiyev. And as a result of that, when Bakiyev is overthrown, and the only female president in Central Asia to ever hold office, Rosa Otunbayeva, takes office as interim president. She's also was the first president to voluntarily leave office, by the way. They institute and develop this parliamentary system to try to diffuse power and move power away from the presidency. So lastly, I'll say that Kyrgyzstan, since 2015, under the president that succeeded Otunbayeva, I think it was Atambayev. It's hard to keep track. They've had a lot of presidents there, right? Something like, you're a volatile country when the presidents per year is like increasing. What is the nominator versus the denominator?
Oh, absolutely,
there?
Yeah. And then Atambayev is succeeded by Jeenbekov, and then Jeenbekov is overthrown by some Bakiyev loyalists, if I'm not even, or could have been Atambayev. I think it was Atambayev, or he was arrested and he was released from jail. And now we've got a couple of interim presidents. So
Sapar Japarov is the president, yes. And he came out of jail, which really highlights the points that I made about, diminishing state capacity, increasing criminalization of the regime, not to the extent that you would see, say, in like Liberia or other parts of 1990s, 2000s Africa, but, of all the regimes, it's got a lot of those issues. And under Atambayev, from 2015 onwards, there's an increasing return to presidential, not authoritarianism, but a lot of autocratic tendencies. Now, there's a limit to how far he was able to take the country in that direction because of the strong civil society, an increasing role of diversity of political parties, the fact that many of the young leadership in Kyrgyzstan had studied abroad and had returned. There's other institutions in Kyrgyzstan, like the American University of Central Asia. There's the OSCE Academy that are in Bishkek and other cities that are pretty, that are training a cohort of elites, just like there is like Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan. And so that has put a check to some degree on how far the Atambayev was able to take the regime more towards an autocratic tilt. But it has certainly moved away from that kind of trajectory of becoming more democratic in recent years. And now with Japarov, there's no doubt that he has taken on a much more autocratic stance, and he has coupled that with a far more openness to, say, alternative methods of revenue collection. In other words, more criminalized, more,
What
willing to
it,
break the rules and undermine the rule of law.
where is Rosa Otunbayeva these days? You know, we almost feel like we had this great moment with her, and then she steps down as interim president.
I don't know where she is, but I went to Bishkek, and there's this really good coffee place, and that's where I hung out and spent a lot of time. I think it's like right next to the Russian embassy, and I did some interviews, met with people there. I was only there for like a few weeks, and there she was, just sitting down, getting coffee, all alone. I think that's the plus to being a democratically minded, open, willing to leave power former president is you don't have to drive around with armor plated windows and never interact with people. So I don't think she's as engaged in the centers of power as she once was.
No, but I do remember there was an interview that I think it was Journeyman Pictures or something like that, right? And yeah, she's walking the streets of Bishkek. She's going through the open markets, and everyone knows her. But she's like a private citizen. Like she has the
She was
street
like sitting at the
credibility.
coffee shop, and
Right.
no one was even like going over and shaking her hand. I was like, holy crap, that's like the former president right there.
Right. I mean, I would have been like, listen, can we get a selfie or something like that? Some students from previous years would have been like, holy crap, Rossi, you got a picture with Rosa Otunbayeva,
I kind of wanted to, but I felt that was like rude. It was a little, I was like, she looks like she's very much enjoying her coffee, and it
Let her
seemed
be.
to me at
Yeah.
that moment, or either that or I was like in an interview or something. I don't remember. It was like 2016.
So it's two are big questions. First one, and then we'll get to the concluding thing here, the China factor. How much of an influential presence is China today? Is China replacing Russia as the big external influencer in the region?
I think that the short answer is yes. I think that there is still significant political, security, and cultural influence that Russia commands in the region. Many people continue to watch Russian media and continue to feel affiliated with Russia. There is also an enormous number of migrant populations from Central Asia that work in Russia, and that continues to link the region to Russia, which is also a way in which the leadership in, say, Tajikistan or Uzbekistan uses that as leverage, by the way. They're like, yeah, you don't have to worry about, you can just turn your back on the Taliban emerging in Afghanistan. But if or you don't really back me and I'm facing this dispute at home, but what if there's what if there's a political crisis that leads to an economic crisis in Tajikistan? You think you have a lot of Tajiks in your country now. Wait till you get another rush or from Uzbekistan or Kyrgyzstan. So there's a lot of geopolitical maneuvering on that front. And of course, there's, there are many economic relationships linking Russia to Central Asia, whether it's, commodities or just a shuttle trade. But that said, I think that China has increasingly exercised a lot of influence in the region. I don't have the stats readily available, but there is a very significant shuttle trade. And shuttle trade is basically the kind of informal trading of goods that goes into the public bazaars where people will buy their clothes, and that's where they will get cheap clothing that they can afford and other goods. Maybe not fruit and vegetables, which are all locally grown, but and so on one hand, there's a shuttle trade. On the other hand, there is significant investment in developing infrastructure and raw material access, for trying to get access to raw materials in China. China does not have its own source of oil and gas and many core raw materials, and it is dependent on that. I can't tell you what agency it was part of, but I did get invited to sit in on a U.S. security meeting, not an agency, but like a Beltway Bandit type of like a separate company that was contracted by some 3-letter agency for us to think like long term. And I didn't really realize at the time, but basically the idea was like, the US may eventually go to war with China, and it's going to have to fight, and it'll issue a blockade against China. What's the link between China and Central Asia? Is that an open backdoor? How do we starve China of goods? And, how can we use Central Asia to kind of close that gap? So Central Asia can be an important source of raw materials, especially oil and natural gas for China, that could have long-term and significant geopolitical ramifications for the US and for international security. And there's a good amount of money going into Central Asia to access that and to build infrastructure. And that has also generated a lot of disputes at the local level where people are upset. There's some protests and even some small acts of outbreaks of violence with large numbers of Chinese workers in the locality, or environmental impacts of Chinese-funded or Canadian-funded mining. And lastly, I'll say another thing that China has been influential on increasingly, especially in light of the pandemic, has been to provide a lot of the technical know-how of the technological bases of these repressive regimes. Facial recognition, biometric scanning, CCTV, closed circuit television cameras, all of these things are the increasingly technical side of repression that has ramped up the capabilities of surveillance and control by all autocratic regimes. And Central Asia has taken advantage of that, taken advantage of the fact that it has very increasingly close connections with the main provider of those technical goods, China, but they're also provided by Russia, by the way. So there's that set of relationships too. And by the way, all that data that's scanning people's faces and scanning their biometrics and stuff, all that is being collected with software that China owns and probably can access. So that is another layer of influence or engagement between China and the region. I think there's no doubt that China is basically the core geopolitical player of all the neighbors in Central Asia. At the very least, it is the future emerging leader. Maybe it's neck and neck with Russia, but it's pretty much pulling ahead. Lastly, I'll make a final point. And I think that this is a good way to think about the geopolitical relationships between China, Russia, and Central Asia, and the US in Central Asia. There's a book published by Alex Cooley called Great Games, Local Rules. And the argument was in that book, it was published in 2012. The argument was that Central Asia, its leaders are very skillful in using its geopolitical and international relationships to shore up their domestic power. They're not pawns that are used by Russia and China and the US. In fact, it's almost the opposite, that they're very good in manipulating and getting the US to invest and build a base that then they take over, or get them to, if you're going to get kicked out, we need another $300 million, or you want to station your troops here to go into Afghanistan, well, that's going to cost you. And same thing with Russia and China. I think that model was very accurate up until maybe 5 years ago. And now I think it's not. I think it's way more complicated. I think the leaders of Central Asia don't have full control over the intersection of international and domestic dimensions. I think it's way more diversified. And I think that these regimes are confronting a wider diversity of challenges. I don't think we're likely to see a string of revolutions overtake them, but I think that it's a lot less definite that they will be able to, that any individual leader will be able to stay in power for many decades. It's still likely, but it's less likely than it was, because they have less command and control over all the things that are happening in their country.
So the Nazarbayevs of the age are effectively going to be phased out.
Well, I think it's a lot harder to be a Nazarbayev. So I'll put it that way. I mean, whether they stay or don't stay is hard to predict, right? Anyone who studies this region doesn't want to be, end up like the Sovietologists of 1989 and be like, oh crap, I'm doing my entire dissertation on the future of the Soviet Union. I think none of us want to predict, but I would say that it just strikes me as that idea that they can manipulate the geopolitical arrangements and the international dimension to shore up their power at home. It's not, we haven't even talked about all the other things of We can talk about Afghanistan, Islam, and there's many aspects. They have a lot of problems they're managing. It's not so easy to just control everything.
So one final question. It's a big one, but it's a nice way of tying everything together. And I think we almost started off with this question. What can Central Asia teach us? Right? Why should more Americans, why should college students, follow you and say, hey, go learn about Central Asia? What can we get out of it?
Um, I mean, there are many things that you can learn from Central Asia. Basically, every topic, whether it's oil or ethnic violence or whatever, there's something to be learned. Autocratic regimes. I would say, in terms of domestic affairs, I think that Central Asia brings to light how autocratic regimes remain intact and the longevity of autocratic regimes. Central Asia also opens up a little bit of information. It helps us understand how autocratic regimes, steal from their countries and stash their money abroad. And there's a whole dynamic about, and so that I think, can help us understand the limits of democracy promotion and the challenges of curtailing authoritarianism. But perhaps, what is perhaps more interesting for your students and for many who look at Central Asia as sort of part of a international community sort of way. One lesson that can be engaged or taken from Central Asia is how countries will manage the new multipolar world we now live in. We no longer live in a bipolar world of the Cold War, or in the 1990s, it was a question of whether the US was going to be a unipolar world. It's now clear that there are many global powers emerging, and this is the new international context. And that's a world that Central Asian regimes have been dealing with for the last 30 years. They've been managing and balancing the demands of US, China, and Russia, not to mention, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and India. And so understanding, multi-vector politics, multipolar geopolitical maneuvering, and how that impacts a country's domestic politics, I think, and the international consequences of all these things. I think this is a new world we live in, and Central Asia has been in that world for some time.
So the East is the new West. It's the new area to invest in. It's a new area to discover. Not only that, I would imagine if you go into academia or you want to be like, hey, I'm going to study Central Asia, I can't imagine the competition is going to be that large.
Well, okay, so in terms of professional opportunities, I would say that there are not as many professional opportunities, and I teach a graduate class on Central Asia itself, and I tell people, like the class that I teach is using Central Asia as an example of what we see globally around the world, whatever topic we focus on. Because the odds are that you're not going to spend your life focusing on a region that is basically less important in terms of security and economic investment to the US. It is not isolated, but it is further afield than, say, Western Europe. But there are areas, there are professional opportunities that can be tied to the region. Absolutely. But it also is a very rich, example of many of the things we see around the globe.
I think that's a great way of ending it. A region that people, for the most part, know very little about is, when one looks at it, unbelievably familiar to other areas that are more prominent.
Right.
I want to thank you for coming on and speaking with me and my students and the general audience in YouTube about a region that I'm pretty certain by this point students are much more interested in and want to learn a lot more on. Come back next time. When we do this class again, let's do this again. I think
Sounds great.
This was a great opportunity here. So
Great
thank
to
you
be
very
here.
much for your time and your input, and for all of you that are enrolled in class. That wraps up our area studies. We are flying out of Bishkek, and metaphorically, we're going to spend the last week or so in Vienna. I don't know. I just want to, and we'll sit around in some coffee house or some, Grechenbeisel, and over some coffee, beer, and whatever. We'll discuss what have we learned over the past 5 to 6 weeks. So anyway, thank you for joining us, and we will see you all next time. Thank you once again, Dr. Markowitz.
You bet. Thank you.